Allegra Stratton now. Phillip Souta is head of business for New Europe, and Conservative MP Mark Reckless was one of the sponsors of today's private member's bill on leaving the EU. Just on that narrow point first about the fact that even if there's a freeze in the budget, our contributions would still go up. How do you think that will go down with your colleagues?
I mean, I think it's extraordinary. I mean, last surgery I did, I had a number of police officers came in and they were saying to me why, when their pay was frozen, why were benefits being increased by inflation? And I found that difficult enough to explain without trying to explain to them that while their pay is frozen, the EU should have an inflationary increase or more, and that's guaranteed in its budget.
So it's unacceptable to you?
To be a member of an organisation where the budget can only ever go up, or as William Hague said in terms of powers, that it's just always powers being taken from the nation states to the European Union and never being returned. That's democratically unsustainable.
Unsustainable and not very popular, you would think.
Well, there's obviously a problem with the EU budget, but the interesting thing is that so many people in this country, when they're asked how much they think we contribute to the European Union, they'll say something along the lines of 20 or 25% of our GDP or our national income. The reality is that it's about 1%. So it's not as much as people think.
But the idea of it going up,
no, the idea of it
our contribution going up, even if it were frozen,
the Commission isn't going to get 5%. But the big challenge for David Cameron and for British foreign policy is that if we veto it, it's going to go up in 2014 by 2% anyway. So that is a reason to negotiate, and that's what we should be doing. Just
to pick up Douglas Carswell's point in the film, I mean, when you were elected a couple of years ago, was the idea of leaving Europe kind of bonkers?
I think it was more on the fringes of politics, where it now seems to have come to the mainstream. And if you look at the polling at this, there's been a fairly consistent trend of ignoring don't knows about a sort of 3-2 margin in favour of leaving the EU and becoming an independent country once more. And I think that strength of public feeling is now breaking through into Parliament.
How do you think that will go down in the business community?
Well, I think the business community is obviously by and large in favour of our membership of the European Union because it's so good for us economically, and that's what we're really talking about here. Leave the theology to one side for a moment, but this is about people's jobs and growth, and the debate has changed over the last couple of years, but the reality is people have an opportunity to vote for a party that would take us out of the European Union, and when it matters, people don't vote for UKIP. They got 3.1% in the last general election. And I think that when it matters, they won't vote for what UKIP represents if there were to be a referendum.
I'm trying to think of, you were talking about police officers and other constituents, but if you had to go to businesses in this country, or the Prime Minister had to go to the businesses in this country and say, we are Conservatives, we're the party of business, we'd like to get out of Europe and it's going to cost you, that's going to be a very hard sell, isn't it?
I mean, I think what Douglas's debate did today is it opened up the issue of what will we do when we come out of the EU. All this law that's been passed over the last 40 years, what of it will we keep, and what of it will we look at and say, well, actually we can do this better for our country.
But you've got to get there, and I'm suggesting to you, not only do you have problems with the Prime Minister and others in the party and in Parliament, but even the business community that is broadly supportive of your party, one assumes, you're going to have difficulty there, aren't you?
But I think the same point can be made with the money. I mean, last year, our contribution to the EU was £19.5 billion. That's about the same that's spent on the whole of policing in this country. And actually, if you say to business, well, the worst, I mean, I think we'll get, a Swiss-style free trade relationship, and we should trade freely with the whole world, not just a declining part of it. But even if you had to pay the whole of the common external tariff for every export from this country to the EU, that would cost, I think, between about £6 and £8 billion. You'd have enough money left over to more than halve corporation tax to bring it below the Irish rate.
I think, with the greatest of respect to Mark, I think that would be tantamount to economic self-harm. I mean, if we were to leave the EU, if you take one very practical example, it's useful to look at it in terms of, again, people's jobs. About 700,000 people in this country are employed in the automotive sector. About 50% of the cars that we make in this country go to other EU member states. If we were to leave the European Union, we would be paying a 5% tariff on cars and an 11% tariff on cars and vans. And the idea that the government would somehow pick up that tab, I think, is fanciful.
Just very briefly, fanciful. I mean, you're not. It's not going to happen, is it? It's not going to be.
Just to compare the size of the numbers, the cost Philip is talking about is tiny compared to even just the amount we pay.
Well, Mark,
into
I don't think that's right, because I mean, if you talk to Japanese car companies, they will say we're not going to stay if you leave.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. Sorry about that. Now, for years, Silvio Berlusconi has kept all of Europe entertained and amused. The man who saw himself